What happens when a millennia old empire collapses and the world as we knew it ceases to exist? It's not the end of history, but the tumultuous beginning of something extraordinary. Welcome to a journey through an era often labeled the Dark Ages, but which, in reality, was a fiery melting pot of cultures, conflicts, and rebirths. Let's talk about the early Middle Ages, that fascinating period from the 5th to the 11th century that reshaped the map of Europe and the Mediterranean, laying the foundations for the world we know today. I will guide you through its complexities, from the fragmentation of the Roman Empire to the rise of hybrid kingdoms, from Rome's last desperate surge in the east to the irresistible rise of a new faith that would forever change the face of the Mediterranean. Prepare to discover how the collapse of a giant allowed the emergence of incredible new powers. The early Middle Ages were not a period of stagnation but a dynamic and complex era which witnessed the political, social, and cultural reorganization of entire civilizations. It was a period that opened with the most iconic and in some ways traumatic event in Western history, the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. But we shouldn't think of this date as a light switch, but rather as a slow and inexorable decline. The empire didn't disappear overnight, rather, it was transformed, or rather, absorbed and reshaped by new forces. This power vacuum paved the way for the rise of new political and cultural entities, which would redefine the geopolitical balance of two continents. Imagine a fragmented Europe, where the ancient Roman provinces became the playground for new tribes and peoples, but also a Mediterranean that, from a Roman lake, transformed into a crossroads of unexpected cultures and trade. The point is this: if we look at this era only through the lens of decline, we lose sight of the extraordinary human capacity to adapt, innovate, and create. The early Middle Ages is the story of how the old dies to make room for the new, a new that was often unknown, sometimes violent, but always fertile. With the collapse of Roman central authority, Western Europe found itself in a state of great uncertainty. It was in this context that the Romano-Barbarian kingdoms emerged, a unique phenomenon. These kingdoms were not simple military occupations, but attempts, often complex and contradictory, at coexistence between the pre-existing Latin populations and the new Germanic rulers. Who were these barbarians? They were the Visigoths, who would leave a lasting legacy from Spain; the Franks, whose kingdom would become the linchpin of medieval Europe; the Vandals, who would control North Africa and the western Mediterranean; and the Ostrogoths, who for a time ruled over Italy itself. Each of these peoples brought with them their own laws, traditions, and worldview, radically different from the Roman one. Yet coexistence was inevitable. Imagine the newcomers, proud and often illiterate warriors, finding themselves governing a vast territory populated by educated Latin elites accustomed to a sophisticated administrative system. It was a long and gradual process of cultural fusion, marked by compromises and tensions. The Germans maintained their traditions, their language, although Latin often remained the language of administration and the church, and their customary laws. Let us not forget that their social organization was often tribal, based on personal loyalties rather than an abstract idea of statehood. However, they could not ignore their Roman heritage. They adopted elements of Roman law, its administration, and even its architecture. In many cases, they converted to Christianity, though often in its Arian variant before embracing Catholicism, which created further friction with the Latin populations. On the other hand, Roman society was profoundly affected. New laws, new customs, and a new ruling class changed the social fabric. Urban life, the heart of Roman civilization, suffered a sharp decline, while the countryside acquired new importance. The latifundia became a base for the local power of large landowners, whether Roman or Germanic, laying the foundation for future feudal lordship. The importance of these kingdoms is immense. They laid the foundations for future European national identities. The Frankish kingdom, in particular, with the Merovingian and later Carolingian dynasties, would play a central role in defining a distinct European identity, the fruit of this unprecedented fusion. They were not simple transitional states, but true political and cultural laboratories that shaped the continent for centuries to come. While the West fragmented and redefined itself, in the East the Roman Empire continued to thrive, not as a faded shadow of the past, but as a vibrant and dynamic power. Its capital, Constantinople, founded by Constantine in the 4th century, was a jewel of architecture, culture, and commerce, a far cry from the plunder and decadence of Rome. This empire, which we now call Byzantine, kept alive the flame of Roman civilization, inheriting its traditions, laws, and organization, but reinterpreting them through a Greek and Eastern lens. The culmination of this Byzantine phase came with Emperor Justinian the Fierce, who reigned from 527 to 565 AD. Justinian was an ambitious man, a visionary whose dream was nothing less than to restore the ancient splendor of the Roman Empire, reuniting East and West under a single scepter. His motto: one empire, one church, one law. perfectly summed up his universalistic aspirations. To realize this dream, Justinian launched a series of bold military campaigns to reconquer the West. He had at his side generals of exceptional talent, such as Belisarius, whose strategic prowess is still studied today. Byzantine troops managed to reconquer vast swathes of territory. Italy wrested from the Ostrogoths after years of grueling warfare. The Gothic War lasted from 535 to 553. North Africa, freed from Vandal rule, and part of southern Spain seized from the Visigoths. For a brief, glorious period, the Mediterranean once again became, at least in part, a Roman lake. However, these conquests were fragile and incredibly costly. The Gothic War, in particular, devastated Italy, causing famine and depopulation and irreparably weakening the Byzantine Empire. Economic and human resources were drained, and control over these distant territories proved difficult to maintain in the long term. In Italy, shortly after Justinian's death, much of the peninsula would fall under Lombard rule. Despite the failure to maintain his western conquests, Justinian's legacy was monumental. His greatest legacy was the Corpus Juris Civilis, a vast and systematic codification of Roman law. This monumental work not only saved Roman jurisprudence from oblivion, but became the basis of nearly all modern legal systems in continental Europe. It is a work that demonstrates a far-sighted vision of law as the foundation of civilization. Beyond law, Justinian was also a great patron of the arts and architecture. Under his reign, the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople was built, an architectural masterpiece whose majesty and technical innovation continue to amaze today. It symbolizes the power and sophistication of an empire that, although it failed to restore the West, maintained a civilization of the highest order. Justinian was the last emperor to dream of full reunification, and with him an era of grandiose aspirations ended. While Europe was busy redefining itself and Byzantium was fighting for its survival in the 7th century, in a remote and then relatively influent corner of the Arabian Peninsula, a new force was emerging that would radically change the history of the Mediterranean and the world: Islam. This new monotheistic religion was founded by the Prophet Muhammad, who around 610 AD began receiving the divine revelations that would form the Quran. Islam, meaning submission to God, offered a message of unity, social justice, and clear ethical guidance, which found fertile ground among the fragmented Arab tribes. What happened next was an expansion of unprecedented speed and scope. In just a few decades, beginning with the death of Muhammad in 632 AD, Islamic armies, driven by ardent faith and extraordinary military effectiveness, conquered vast territories. From the Arabian Peninsula, they pushed northward, defeating the Persian Sassanid empires and wresting Syria, Palestine, and Egypt from the Byzantine Empire. They then moved westward, conquering all of North Africa and, in the early 8th century, crossing the Strait of Gibraltar to subjugate much of the Iberian Peninsula, giving birth to Al-Andalus. Within a century, an empire had been formed that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to India, a political and cultural entity of colossal proportions. The impact of this expansion on the Mediterranean was profound and lasting. What for centuries had been the Romans' mare nostrum now became a crossroads, but also a fault line between three emerging civilizations: the Latin Germanic West, the Byzantine Empire, and the new Islamic world. The Mediterranean, far from becoming a barrier, transformed into an extraordinary route of exchange, not only commercial but also cultural. Islamic cities such as Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, and Cordoba became unparalleled centers of learning. From the Arabs came new contributions of scientific, philosophical, and artistic knowledge. It was they who translated and preserved much of the Greco Roman knowledge that had been lost in the West. They were pioneers in mathematics, introducing Indian numerals including zero, astronomy, medicine, and chemistry. Islamic philosophy engaged in dialogue with Aristotle, poetry flourished, and Islamic art created architectural and decorative marvels. And this knowledge spilled over into the Mediterranean, enriching the culture of the time and spurring an intellectual renaissance in the West as well, especially through Islamic Spain and Norman Sicily. But the rise of Islam also profoundly altered the political and religious balance. The Muslim presence in the eastern and southern Mediterranean cut off many of the traditional trade routes with the West, forcing European powers to reorient their trade routes and economies. The Crusades, for example, cannot be understood without considering this new religious and political polarization. It created new challenges for Christianity, but also new opportunities for dialogue and exchange. The borders between these civilizations were not impermeable but porous, and goods, ideas, and people passed across them, giving rise to a complex and fascinating interaction. Islam was not just a conqueror, but a builder of civilizations, leaving an indelible mark on human history and the cultural landscape of the Mediterranean. We have journeyed through an era of extraordinary transformation. The early Middle Ages, far from being a time of darkness, was a melting pot where old and new collided and merged, giving rise to unprecedented realities. We witnessed the birth of the Romano-Barbarian kingdoms, experiments in coexistence that would lay the foundation for the European nations. We have witnessed the last grandiose blaze of the Byzantine Empire under Justinian, guardian of Romanity and beacon of civilization, and we have witnessed the irresistible rise of Islam, a force that not only conquered vast lands but also radiated knowledge and culture, forever redefining the Mediterranean and its history. These are not dark ages, but centuries of gestation in which the modern world began to take shape from the ashes of an empire.